Well, on that last video, I pressed stop before I was done, so let's finish out chapter 6 and then we'll move on to chapter 8. I've moved on to the next slide. We just finished mental duress, and now we're talking about unconscionability, which another word for that is contract of adhesion. Two things I want to mention. One, when I was in law school, this was the only doctrine of law that seemed to touch where I was in my own experience. It was about growing up poor, essentially, and having someone take advantage of you with overreaching, fraudulent, or unfair tactics. In law school, I only read about rich people's problems, except in this one area. The other thing I want to mention about this is I think the book is entirely wrong on this particular area of law. The book seems to think that if you raise the argument of unconscionability, you win. Well, in fact, courts have not been very generous with this doctrine, and I would argue that most cases do not allow the victim to win. Is certainly not as easily as the book suggests it is. So unconscionability is a narrow doctrine. It was created in the 60s when the civil rights movement was strong and people were actually concerned about the issues with poor people. And it was a doctrine that allowed people to undo bad deals where there was either unfair procedure involved in the contract or unfair substance of the deal. There was one case that involved a $10,000 freezer. Somebody paid $10,000 for a freezer that was in fact worth $300. The court said, no, that's totally unfair, totally one-sided, because the buyer spoke English as a second language and the terms were in small print and the overall deal was unfair. So there was both procedural unconscionability as well as substantive unconscionability. And that was a very rare. In fact, it's so rare that it's the only book that's the only case of its kind that is in most textbooks talking about this doctrine. So the idea is that an unconscionable contract is also called a contract of adhesion. And when we think about contracts that we're forced into when we buy, say, a stereo at Best Buy or an iPhone at Verizon or whatever, they have small terms and they're in small print, and we don't have a lot of choice around the terms. In fact, we have zero choice. Same thing goes with a click-through contract. When you sign on to the web and you click a box that says I agree to these terms, you don't have a realistic choice. If you want the software, if you want to look at the website, you've got to actually click and say you agree to the terms. So those are called contracts of adhesion. Essentially, what you should know about this is an argument. It's not frequently a winner, but it's based on the idea that it's so unfair, either procedurally or substantively, that it undercuts the person's intent to enter into the same agreement. The book says on page 126, quote, generally, if a contract of adhesion can be shown, the party with the weaker bargaining position can avoid his obligation. Not true. Not true. His examples, 1, 2, 3, I disagree with all of them. So I think that he's just flat out wrong on this topic. Let's move into mistake. Mistake occurs when one or both of the parties is under a misconception as to the subject matter of the contract. There are two different kinds. There's a mutual mistake and a unilateral mistake, and they have different outcomes. If it's a mutual mistake, the contract is void as long as the mistake was of the type that it could not be foreseen, and as long as the risk of mistake has not been specifically contracted. So if a party actually puts in a clause and says, if that allocates the risk of mistake, then there would be no getting out of the contract. You just follow that clause. So mutual mistake versus unilateral mistake, where one party to the contract is mistaken, that one may be enforceable by the innocent party. So if you have Bonnie buying what both parties thought was the antique trunk, but in fact it was not, then Bonnie can return the trunk because there is no deal. Here's a famous old case on mutual mistake called Sherwood versus Walker, involving an apparently barren cow, a cow that could not be pregnant, Rose II of Aberlour. The parties agreed for a price for her, but then they found out that she was pregnant, and because both parties thought she could not have a calf, the contract was voidable. Here's another example of mutual mistake where a seller and a buyer both think that they're selling a signed copy of a Virginia Woolf novel. In fact, years before, it was a forged, but neither party knew that, and so you have the right to cancel or rescind the contract. Another example of mutual mistake, this one actually happened to me at one point. You go to an interior decorator to pick a carpet and ask the clerk to show you a navy carpet. The sales slip says navy. When you look at the carpet in the daylight, the customer determines it's black, in which case both the seller and buyer were in error. Since there was never a true and complete meeting of the minds, there's no mutual assent, and the buyer would be entitled to return the carpet and obtain a full refund. In a unilateral mistake situation, the innocent party can enforce the contract. If the mistaken party wants out of the deal, they have to show that it would be unconscionable, or that the other party had reason to know of the mistake, or the other party's fault caused the mistake. So it's easy to enforce it if you're the innocent party. It's harder to get out of it if you're the mistaken party, and you have to have these two things.